government has rubbished the allegations made by Alliance for Change's leader Kemraj Ramjatan that the ruling party is hiding $50 billion acquired largely through the National Industrial and Commercial Investments Limited (Nicil) in secret bank accounts. This is seen by the administration as the latest attempt at political grandstanding and creating unwarranted hysteria among the Guyanese public.
National Industrial and Commercial Investments Limited, it has a real role in our society, particularly when we put aside our earlier philosophy and thinking that we should own the government and the people should own all the heights of industry and commerce, some 85% at maximum. When we move from that, this Nicil is set up there because you still need government you still need an agency that will take risks and lead some developments where the private sector is reluctant to for some reasons. And a good example of that is the Berbice bridge, the Berbice River Bridge, which I think all Guyanese would say, even though it's politically opportune also to make certain criticisms, but I think every Guyanese would say we're proud about it and life is better for having the Berbice River Bridge. And Nicil played a particularly important leading role in initially setting it up, taking a lot of the ownership, and as the initial risks were handled, and as the bridge was built, others would come in. And this is how things happen quite a lot.
AFC arrived at $50 billion is still a mystery. No explanations are offered, and neither is any evidence to substantiate this forthcoming. Yet this figure is being bandied around authoritatively by Ramjatan and supported by certain segments of the media.
They should publish publicly the basis on which they arrived at this $50 billion. Because they're not saying it is roughly, they're not saying we guessed a figure, they're not saying we think, they are making a definitive statement. And it is not sufficient to say we look at something and we think maybe. You wouldn't accept that from anybody else. And so they need to come clean and say to the people of Guyana, this $50 billion that they are treating as gospel, they need to come clean and say this is how we arrived at this $50 billion. The fact of the matter is that Nicil operates within the Companies Act. That is a fact. Nicil is a company, it is registered as such, and it is governed thereby. That is a fact, that's an inescapable fact. Nicil is audited by the Auditor General as a company and as a holding company, as a group, a company with subsidiaries. Nicil's consolidated audited financial statements are tabled in Parliament and have been tabled in Parliament. As soon as the audits are completed for the group, those audits are tabled in Parliament. Those are the reports. Nicil has also made public details of every single privatization transaction that it has conducted up to recently. In fact, colleagues would recall that a special seminar was held at which the private sector was invited,
and the press,
other stakeholders and the media, at which Nicil disclosed every single transaction, every corporate disposal, that is disposal as a corporate entity, every property sale, every asset sale. And a document was produced and made publicly available. The mode of privatization, the details of the transaction, mode meaning public advertisement, how many times, etc., the details of the transaction were all included in that documentation. This is a classic example of what I'm speaking about. The opposition doesn't want to go to that document. That document was distributed publicly and freely, is widely available. It documented all of the transactions. But it is easy and convenient and politically opportunistic for the opposition, and in particular certain sections of the opposition, instead of referring to those publicly available sources, instead of recognizing that we have never hesitated to speak publicly about these transactions, They instead concoct and fabricate a controversy.
The government has explained that the transactions of Nicil are in no way illegal. From Nicil's bank account is deposited into the consolidated fund when dividends are declared.
The privatization procedure was the subject of a white paper presented by the Chelly Jagan administration in the parliament sometime in 93 or 94, debated and unanimously approved by the National Assembly. Ramjatang, Nagamutu were part of the PPP, sitting on the government benches. Nicil was identified as the body to do the transactions. Prior to that, the privatization was done through about 5 different entities under the PNC. Ministry of Finance, the Nicil, because they created Nicil, Office of the President, and various other places. And there was no accounting record of these transactions. When the PPP took power, we decided to have one single policy, and we took that policy to the Parliament for its approval, and it was approved. And the policy is that this thing will be done through Nicil and the privatization unit, that it will be done by utilizing this mode of public advertisement, inviting tenders, etc., what the Minister of Finance explained. And Nicil has records of all these transactions. And at the event at Pegasus, a chronicle of those transactions were done, including the names of the people to whom the properties were sold, when they were sold, the price for which they were sold. What is the mystery? What other information that you need?
Berbice Bridge is perhaps one of the biggest success stories that was spearheaded by Nicil and stands as a shining example of private capital being invested in public infrastructure, thereby boosting both the public and private sectors.
Nicil, as the whole government holding company of equity investments, has scored some resounding successes. The Prime Minister mentions Berbice River Bridge, and I want to elaborate on that point. Frankly speaking, the Berbice River Bridge is an outstanding pioneer achievement for this country. Not only from the standpoint that it is a bridge. Of course, it is a bridge, and if you speak to Berbicians, they will tell you. I remember when the bridge was being opened, there was an elderly man sitting, and tears were running down his face. And some of the young journalists around me found it funny, and they were laughing why the man was crying. And I said to them, you should go and have a word with him and find out why he's crying. Because I have no doubt that my own grandfather, who was a Berbician, had he been here, he would have been crying too. Because the struggles of Berbice farmers, who sometimes would have their produce stuck at the ferry stelling there for sometimes 2 or 3 days. If it was vegetables, wilting. If it was livestock, dying on the truck there, waiting until the ferry was running and they were willing to take trucks. Sometimes trucks took 2 or 3 days to get across that ferry. Ordinary commuters like you and I took hours. In fact, you would be delighted if you made it across in 3 hours. The standard joke that is given is that a Berbice family who takes their relatives to the airport to go back to New York, their relatives would get back to New York, go to bed, sleep, wake up, and get to work the next morning. And the Guyanese family who lives in Corriverton would still be at Rossignol waiting to cross the river. And this is not something that I say in jest. This is a fact that we all live through. So, put aside that fact that the infrastructure has made a difference to people's lives, has integrated markets, has brought the farmer in Blackbush Polder closer to the purchase of vegetables at border market. Put aside that fact for the time being. Put that fact aside for the time being. The Berbice River Bridge is the first instance of private capital being invested in public infrastructure. It's the first instance of that. And this mode of public-private partnership or of privately financed public infrastructure is a mode that is recognized around the world. You have privately financed hospitals, privately financed roads, privately financed airports as a new vehicle around the world, large, mature economies. Private investment in public infrastructure is now regarded as the way to go. In many countries, the state no longer invests in large infrastructure. If you want a port, you find a company to build that port. If you want a major new highway, you find a company to build the highway. If you want a new airport, you find a company to build the airport. We should be proud in Guyana that we have completed successfully, piloted and led by Nicil, such a successful private investment in public infrastructure project. If you have a public infrastructure project that generates a rate of return that is attractive to the private sector, and they are willing to put their money into it, and they will get an acceptable rate of return, that is something to be encouraged. It is good for the private sector, and it is good for the public sector, and it is good for the consuming public. And we must not be afraid to acknowledge these positive things. And we must not be afraid to speak of them publicly. And it is Nicil, as the government holding company, that structured this entire transaction. In most other developing countries, you would need an international financial institution or you would need an international investment bank to structure such a complex transaction, to prepare the documentation, to explain the documentation to your private sector, to work with the private investors to get them on board. We should be proud in Guyana that we structured that transaction using local expertise, and we concluded that transaction with local investment. And Nicil did that.
Notwithstanding the plethora of information already in the public domain of various projects and Nicil, government is prepared to provide any additional information or answer any questions, but maintains that the fracas over Nicil is merely a storm in a teacup.